Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Spotlights event. I'm Andrew Neilson. I'm Director of Campaigns at the Howard League. Today in this event, as you can probably see from the screen, we're going to be discussing the pressures on probation with an illustrious panel, on which more in a moment. But before I introduce the panel, I just want to go through a few housekeeping rules first. To begin with, this event is being recorded and it will be sent to everybody that RSVP'd to the event, and it will be open for everyone to watch. Unfortunately, we can't see you all, but we have a chat box, so please do use that chat box to say hello. Feel free to share your thoughts or add links or any helpful materials that you want to share with the audience. If you have questions, we have a Q&A box. And the event is going to take the form of a panel discussion, so ideas can be shared. And once the panel have given their thoughts, we will have a Q&A section to the event. So if you have questions for that, then the Q&A box is the place to put those questions. And also please be aware that we might post clips from the event on social media. So if you do find yourself speaking, if you can be as concise and self-contained in what you're saying as possible, that's always helpful. Do feel free to tweet or post on any other social media about the event and use our hashtag Howard League Spotlights, or tag the Howard League's account at the Howard League on X, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So that's the housekeeping rules. What are we discussing today? As probably everybody on this Zoom knows, the government has high expectations for its sentencing bill that's now being scrutinised in Parliament, or it will be shortly. It had its second reading at the beginning of the month. The Parliament is now in recess for party conference season, but as soon as Parliament's back, that bill will be going through the Commons and then the House of Lords. And that bill, the high expectations the government has for it, are around the fact that the measures in the bill, ministers tell us, will ensure that prisons in England and Wales never run out of space again. There are a number of proposals around releasing people earlier, using community orders more than short prison sentences. There are also proposals that will potentially see a massive increase in the use of electronic monitoring, as well as the imposition of new punitive measures around the introduction of restriction zones, curbs on driving or attending public events. All of these proposals potentially heaping more work on the probation service, which is already grappling with huge caseloads. Meanwhile, ministers are promising £700 million in additional funding for probation, although that is also, I think, dwarfed by the £7 billion being committed to building new prisons. So what we're going to discuss today is what this legislation means for the probation service. And as I said, we have a panel of experts to discuss the issues. And the panel comprises of Martin Jones, the Chief Inspector of Probation and a former Chief Executive of the Parole Board, Helen Schofield, Chief Executive of the Probation Institute. We have Gay Delap, a retired teacher who had a particularly unfortunate experience of electronic monitoring. And we're very grateful to Gay for being willing to share her story today. And we also have Tanya Bassett, a national official at the Probation Union, NAPO. So I'm going to invite each of our panelists to say a few words, and then I'll open it out to questions. You might see another panelist called Mike, who is a friend of Gay's, who may join to lend Gay some support when she speaks. But without further ado, I'm going to invite Martin to speak first. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for that introduction. I think it's incredibly timely that we hold this event, and huge thanks to the Howard League for setting it up. So I'm delighted to be here this afternoon to talk about the pressure on probation. It's the key thing on my mind at present, and hopefully maybe to identify some potential opportunities. Now, this event comes at a timely moment because, as Andrew says, there is now more pressure on probation than there has ever been. As Chief Inspector, it's my role to shine a light on the quality of the work taking place on the front line of probation and youth justice services. And as the independent watchdog, it's crucial that I tell it as it is, explaining what I see on the front line, the actual delivery, rather than what we might want to happen. Now, I was appointed Chief Inspector of Probation in March of last year, and at the point of appointment, I already knew that the service was already under massive pressure. Under the last completed inspection round under my predecessor, all but one probation delivery unit was inspected, had been rated inadequate or requires improvement, and the service was still in recovery from the turmoil of transforming rehabilitation and other change, and in particular, the loss of experienced staff and the damage caused through that. 18 months on, I would say that the pressure has increased rather than slackened. In the summer of 2024, the government announced its SDS 40 changes to free up pressure on our prisons, which were at breaking point. But of course, this piled further pressure on an already overstretched probation service. And whilst I think the probation service performed absolute miracles to ensure that that was handled about as well as was possible to be hoped, that's not really sustainable for the long term unless it's properly resourced. And things have not stopped there. We've had further changes being introduced through the fixed term recall changes, which are now being implemented. And of course, as Chief Inspector of Probation, I have publicly called for the government to look at what is happening on recall. You know, the recall population has grown exponentially over the last 30 years. When I joined the Home Office as a junior civil servant some 30 odd years ago, there were fewer than 100 prison places taken up by those on recall. The last published figures, that number was 13,538. I'm not sure that the FTR 48 changes necessarily fixes the underpinning issues for the long term. We've also had the David Gauke sentencing review, which was undertaken at pace. I welcome the conclusion of David Gauke's review in seeking to rebalance our system from custody back to the community. I've described it as a once-in-a-generation opportunity that must be seized. But if it is to work, we need to focus more on the work of probation. To quote from David Gauke, in any scenario, longer-term, sustainable investment for the probation service and third sector partners in the community is essential. In the immediate term, the probation service will need to prioritise its resources and focus its efforts where it will have the highest impacts in terms of reducing reoffending and managing risk of harm. So if I look at the day-to-day delivery when I'm out on inspection, what do I see? In terms of results, sadly, 100% of the probation delivery units that I've inspected since my appointment have been rated inadequate or requires improvement. Now, these results are driven by the fact that we have too few staff with too little experience managing too many cases. But if you look beneath that headline, the poor outcomes are primarily driven by the probation service's work on public protection, which I describe as one of my 3 pillars of good probation practice. In every PDU that we've inspected, that is the lowest scoring area of work. I have not seen a single good score on public protection across the near 40 probation delivery units I've inspected. In essence, the service as a whole does not understand enough about the risk of the people they're managing, and they are potentially missing opportunities to mitigate and manage that risk. Is that the fault of the probation service? Absolutely not. I think there are gaps in processes, there aren't enough staff, there's more to do on effective information sharing. We have an inexperienced staff group. Is there a wise head in the office that people can talk to when they face uncertainty? Our senior probation officers are massively overstretched and they do not have the time to identify issues and provide support and direction where needed. Having reflected on the results of the first 6 regions, I've concluded that on the current trajectory, I will rate every single PDU as requires improvement or inadequate. So should I just carry on like Cassandra, saying there's a problem whilst nobody notices, or do I try to do something different? So I've decided to change our approach. For the next 6 months, the inspectorate's priority will be looking at public protection. I want to shine a light on what is going wrong, and perhaps most importantly, why. To be clear, my focus here is on helping to provide a path to improvement rather than beating up a service, which I already think has been beaten up over the last 10 years. I want to identify and exemplify effective practice. I want to identify blockages and what may need to be cleared. If it can precipitate some improvement, that will be a good thing. Now, that also matters because public protection work, which is not good enough, is masking some positive green shoots of progress. In the best PDUs that I've inspected, I've started to see some good and even outstanding work on other areas of probation business in terms of desistance and engagement. In our first approved premises inspection, I've commended that approved premises as an outstanding approved premises, providing really good quality work in terms of protection of the public and rehabilitation. And when I go out on inspection and I talk to probation staff, I see people that want to do their very best. They want to do a good job. We need to give them a chance to succeed. We cannot allow this opportunity to be missed. The government has announced plans for £700 million of additional funding. They've announced extra recruitment. That's a good starting point, but we need more clarity. We need more investment for the long term. So to conclude, I am desperate for the probation service to succeed, because that is the pathway to safer communities, fewer victims, lower reoffending rates, and rebuilding broken lives. But we need to ensure that the sentencing reforms are properly funded and properly thought through. We need to go further in developing local ownership and accountability. We need to improve morale and confidence within the service, and we need to give the probation staff better tools. We need to change the culture of fear that leads to a disproportionate fear of serious further offending that also, I think, impacts upon our astonishingly high recall rates. We need to be able to hold risk in the community. We always have. In the last 12 months, the probation service has recalled over 40,000 people. Was that always necessary for the protection of the public? And finally, we should not apologise for the fact that the evidence shows you are most likely to reduce reoffending, prevent future victims, promote rehabilitation by developing a relationship with people and seeking to tackle the underlying failure and chaos that invariably underpins reoffending. That is the heartbeat of probation. We need to maintain that focus. I look forward to the further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Just a reminder, if anyone has questions, we have a Q&A box, and if you can enter your questions there, we'll come to those later. I'm now going to ask Helen to say some words.
Thank you, Andrew, and hello, everyone. It's good to be here. And yes, extremely timely opportunity, isn't it? Just a 10 seconds on the Probation Institute itself, for anyone who doesn't know. We are a small professional body supporting probation and wider rehabilitation organisations. We're a membership organisation. Our work is about professional development, professional discussion. We offer research events, publications, position papers, and we run a set of annual research awards. We collaborate a lot with the universities, not only in England, Wales and Scotland, but internationally, increasingly. And we're members and sit on a number of boards, panels, including the Probation Professional Registration Panel, and have recently been part of the discussion about our future probation service, of which we may want to talk as we go forward. What I'm going to say is backed up in considerable extent by research carried out by Liverpool John Moores University, a team of people at Liverpool John Moores University, who found probation practitioners, as Martin has said, working incredibly hard in a very difficult environment, not happy, very individually pressured, feeling unsupported, and often feeling very fearful about their day-to-day responsibilities. I don't think this is a moment to go back into history and ask why, but I think it's right to say that the pressure isn't just coming from numbers. And so, in fact, what I'm going to say is that the greater pressure is probably coming from the future, in reality, than it is from the past. We know that, 30 years of managerialism and increasing pressure about the management of risk have taken the service in a particular direction. We know that transforming rehabilitation was a very serious political mistake, complete failure of understanding of the probation service. And we know how hard it's been for the service to begin to recover through COVID. Different cultures, conflicting messages, complicated structures, a target operating model that was sound but has proved very difficult to implement consistently, and was probably not as forward-looking as it needs to be. So we found ourselves with probation service 1 HMPPS, increasingly close to the prison service, which in the Probation Institute we find, if it's intellectually rational, it's certainly culturally inappropriate. but also a probation service within the civil service, which I don't think we find even intellectually rational, let alone culturally rational, and certainly culturally inappropriate. It's not appropriate to put a service integral to community safety in communities into as part of a government department, not even an arm's length body. And so we find ourselves with excessive increasing prison population. The last government unwilling to do anything about that until it was almost too late, and running out of space, and then a government which is committed for the same reasons of lack of space, but also important to point, I think, to a new prisons and probation minister who, on the face of it, is keen to reduce prison numbers, but probably doesn't have a huge experience in carrying that through. And so through the sentencing bill, we come to the proposals for huge increases in electronic monitoring, proposals around surveillance and monitoring that are not compatible with the focus of rehabilitation, surveillance, naming and shaming of people on unpaid work, and greater use of artificial intelligence for assessment, monitoring people's mobile phones, which is currently used in many prisons, profiling and so forth. And so of all of these pressures, for us, it is the increased use of electronic monitoring and of artificial intelligence which has caused us in the Probation Institute to really pause and think about pressures on the future. We need to understand pressure differently, really, because the drive towards technology will be a greater pressure than even the current prison numbers. So the question we have to look at is how can the technology, this revolution in technology is coming into the justice system very fast. We know that quite a lot of the 700 million is going to be spent on technology. How can we use this in a way that is helpful and not just controlling? How can probation mitigate the harmful impacts of technology? And how can we do that, particularly given the likelihood of the increasing use of the private sector to control and implement these measures? So in our view, it's time for a very serious rethink about the operational control of electronic monitoring and artificial intelligence, particularly those artificial intelligence which will be used for surveillance. Probation should very seriously consider whether moving to take control of electronic monitoring, contracting out the equipment, and looking at a range of new roles dedicated to the safe operational rehabilitative management of the future technology. So all of these surveillance measures that we're seeing should be owned by the probation service, not by the private sector, and decisions about suitability and breach should be made by probation officers whose focus must continue to be about risk and rehabilitation. This potentially changes the future recruitment, potentially changes the future training of probation officers. It would be a bigger service, it would be a wider service with a wider range of roles. If not, I think the risk is the probation service becomes increasingly unimportant as the pressure of technology moves the whole system forward into a different environment. So I think in parallel with that, and not an obvious immediate fit, there is pressure to address the location and the governance of the probation service out of the civil service, away from the prisons, facing into and working with communities, looking at the model of youth justice, which is centrally funded, of course, but managed locally. So I think that people will say the probation service had enough change. And I think it's not okay, unfortunately, to say the probation service has had enough change and can't face any further change. I think it's absolutely essential that the management, the leadership of the probation service looks with this government very hard at what the future probation service in the mid-20th century looks like, and we stop looking backward, and we worry less about the numbers and more about who's controlling the governance and the arrangements of the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And obviously, you talked about electronic monitoring there. The biggest measure in the bill around this is around the earned progression model that the government sees people on standard determinant sentences doing, where you would be released at the third waypoint, and then spend the next third of your sentence. Everyone would be spending the next third of the sentence potentially under tag, which is a big expansion of EM. We've heard some of the concerns there from the Probation Institute and Helen. I'm now going to invite Gay to say something about her own personal experience of being under electronic monitoring, because I think it does have a dimension of a cautionary tale about having too much faith in just electronic monitoring for its own sake. So, Gay.
Oh, thank you very much, everyone. I'm just going to put it in a framework in case you don't know the circumstances. I'll just start at the beginning. I was a member of Just Stop Oil, and on the 9th of November 2022, I climbed a gantry to stop the traffic on the M25 because the government had just given 124 new licenses for oil. So our demand was to stop all oil. That's just the framework, so you know why I was there and what the aims of the action was, the climate action. I spent 3.5 months in Peterborough prison, having been sentenced to 20 months on the 1st of August 2024. So quite a long stretch while I was on remand. And I spent 3.5 months in Peterborough, and then subsequently, because of the whole tagging debacle, I spent a further 42 days and 42 nights in Eastwood Park in Bristol. So the first tagging incident came when I had a DVT, I had a deep vein thrombosis, so I couldn't have a tag on my leg. That's the background of why I needed to have a wrist tag. So shortly after the trial, first trial, I was tagged, and they came to tag me, and they couldn't find a small enough tag for my wrist. First of all, they came not knowing. There's very little communication in Serco and EMS. So they came prepared to do a leg tag. They went away, came back, and said they couldn't find a small enough one. In fact, the woman from Serco was very cross and said, your wrists are too small. I would just show you that my wrist is a perfectly normal wrist for a woman of my age and size, and nothing special at all. I did subsequently discover that actually Serco have wrist tags for electronic wrist tags for children. Sad to say, but that's another story. Then I was in court and was put on a doorstep convention. So I had to be in my own house from 7 at night till 7 in the morning. What's the next thing that happened? Then I went to be sentenced, and I was released after 3.5 months from Peterborough. I could say quite a lot about the failings of the prison service, but I think I'm going to concentrate on the tagging. So when they came to tag me again, they obviously didn't have any notes. They came and said they didn't have a tag, and this is a failure, really, in a way, for me personally. Though I have a lot of good things to say about how my experience of the probation service was. So when they failed to tag me again, I got a call from my probation officer. She went off sick. I mean, that wasn't her fault. But I had imagined that when you're off sick in the probation service, somebody picks up your file. But I subsequently discovered that doesn't happen. So I had a call to say that I should there was a warrant out for my arrest because they'd failed to tag me. And I will just say that they did lie spectacularly and said the tagging people said that I failed to accept a tag, which wasn't the case at all. So then I was unlawfully at large, quotes. I actually phoned them up and said, can't you hear the difference between the fact that I'm unlawfully at large and you have failed to find a tag to fit me? And the woman for Serco said no, she couldn't hear the difference. So then I was advised to have myself into a police station, but I didn't do that. I waited for them to come and get me. This was just before Christmas last year. So Avon Police said that they would. I had an important medical appointment to go to, and Avon very kindly said they would take me in to Eastwood Park on the 27th, just after Christmas. So, but in fact, they were overridden, and they came to arrest me on the evening Friday of the 20th of December to go to Eastwood Park. So then I was in Eastwood Park for Christmas, New Year, and my 78th birthday. But and I, just to pick up the point you made about recall, I was told there that they reckoned, this was a prison officer told me that there were, in Eastwood Park, there were 40% people there were on recall. And it was true that very often we'd say goodbye to somebody. There's quite a spirit of solidarity in the prison, and I was met with a lot of kindness. I want to make that clear. And we'd say goodbye to and wish people well, and 2 days later they'd be back for the most trivial of reasons. They were late for a probation meeting through no fault of their own, or they didn't have the bus fare, or they didn't have any proper housing. The housing that they were going to was inadequate. There were all sorts of reasons that really are generic failures of the state and the system as we have it. So I was released from Eastwood Park, having done an extra 42 days, 42 nights in Eastwood Park. And I must say, when they came to take me in, I had 10 minutes to pack. Before I went in, the air was blue with what I felt about being recalled through no fault of my own. I mean, I still consider it a gross misjustice, carriage of misjustice, whatever the expression is. Moral injury, I think, is what sort of sums up the feeling that this is basically wrong. This is not my fault. This is your fault. But I think I hope my case is not that common. When I asked the Serco people or EMS whether the difficulties were because it was a wrist tag, they denied that and said no, that wasn't the difficulty. In fact, when Serco or EMS came to Eastwood Prison to fit a tag, they put a 15 centimeters one on me, and previously when they'd fitted one, they said that a 14.5 was too loose. So there was an awful lot of inconsistency and an awful lot of bad communication by the tagging people. They came and checked my tag regularly, and also after 7 to check that I was so I had to be at home after 7. So somebody would drive from Plymouth to Bristol, where I am, which is a fair old drive, check my tag, and then drive back to Plymouth. I mean, the organisation seemed to be broken beyond compare. What else to say? I think maybe I'll end it there and wait till to answer some questions, if that's okay. But not a good experience, and I think ongoing. My nephew has written written to the Ministry of Justice for clarification for Freedom of Information Act, which is interesting because I'll just show you, most of it came back like that. So, you know, we're still trying, but we didn't actually get all the answers that we're still searching for. Okay.
Thank you, Gay.
All right.
That was great, and thank you for sharing that experience with us again. I'm going to invite Tanya, our final speaker, to say some words.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm from NAPO, which is a professional association and the trade union for probation and family court staff. It's been touched on already, but I don't think it can be said enough about just how bad a crisis the probation service is in terms of staffing and workloads. And our members are relentlessly having to firefight dangerous levels of workloads every single day. And as Martin said, it desperately needs some investment and for a government to actually focus on probation and really put the money where the mouth is. But I feel that a lot of the words that have been said so far are quite empty. There's £700 million that's been earmarked for probation, but we feel very confident that most of that is going to go on electronic monitoring to private companies and also to this huge boost in artificial intelligence and the plan for better technology. And anyone who's worked for the Ministry of Justice will know that they have incredibly poor history when it comes to anything that's IT related. And just to further evidence that, and an insult of add insult to injury for our members, despite the trade unions putting in a pay claim in January 2025, we've still not received a formal pay offer from the employer. And it just seems that they have just kicked that into the long grass. So on top of all the additional work they've had to do in the last 12 months, including the fixed term recall releases, they haven't even got a pay offer for them to ballot on to see whether or not their employer actually values them. And I would say that it would be an underestimation to say the level of anger amongst our members about that, which I'm sure will be apparent at our conference next month. In terms of the sentencing bill, NAPO largely welcome the majority of the bill, that notwithstanding that none of it can be implemented if the probation service remains in the crisis that it's in. I think it's quite aspirational, but I have real fears that those aspirations will not be met because there just isn't the capacity for probation to pick up any additional work without some real fundamental changes, some of which Helen picked up on. Those of you who know NAPO will know we have a very strong policy around taking probation out of the civil service and back into local governance and local autonomy, like we had with the Probation Trust, who, very differently to the current play, were all last inspected as being excellent or very good. So it's an almost complete reversal of what we see now. But there are some parts of the sentencing bill that are causing us quite a significant amount of concern. And it was mentioned earlier about unpaid work and this proposal that probation staff will be able to photograph and publish photos of people carrying out unpaid work. Our General Secretary in Lawrence said to The Guardian last week that there is absolutely it serves no value in terms of risk management or rehabilitation. It is purely a way for the state to further humiliate people who are complying with their order, carrying out community service for the benefit of their communities. And the impact of this policy could have huge ramifications, particularly on people's families, namely their children, with this community humiliation even further. There is also a significant risk if any of those people photographed have committed a sexual offence, for example. So I think there was a lot of unforeseen consequences to this policy, and we will certainly be very vocal in challenging that. The other policy, which isn't included in the bill per se, is that a suggestion has been made that private companies will be able to offer unpaid work placements. And some of these potential names they're huge international conglomerates like ASDA providing unpaid work placements. we have previously gone to the ILO around privatisation of unpaid work and the risk of exploitation and slavery. And we have won on both of those referrals. But this goes to another level of exploitation, requiring people to work for, if we use Asda as an example, it's one of the companies that has the highest number of claimants of in-work benefits because their pay is so derisory to their paid staff. The fact that we would further subsidise them with unpaid staff is quite frankly grotesque. And there is also the issue that it's taking paid employment away from communities. There's a big drive in the Chancellor's speech today about getting long-term youth unemployment down. Well, that's not going to be helped if we're putting people on probation into jobs that could be done by people in the local community. So we will be fighting both of those in terms of the unpaid work, but I'm aware that somebody has tabled an amendment regarding the inspectorate, and that the amendment says that the chief inspector has to give the green light for the implementation of the sentencing bill, so that only when the chief inspector deems probation safe enough to be able to do this work can it actually be implemented. I think largely that's been tabled for record. However, NAPO has gone further, and we're saying actually that the chief inspector's powers should be expanded. As it stands at the moment, regional probation directors can declare if a probation delivery unit or region is in such dire states with staffing that they go into what's called the prioritisation framework. But we are aware that our PDs see that as a sign of failure on their part, and there's a huge reluctance to do so. So we would like to see the chief inspector have the power to do that following an inspection and be able to say, this particular PDU must go into the prioritisation framework, because that framework gives our members a little bit of breathing space. It enables them to stabilise the workloads and focus on the key priorities rather than the constant firefighting. So we're hoping that that will get some support. Whether it will or not, whether the government is prepared to hand that power over to the chief inspector, I'm being very careful not to personalise this, Martin, yet to be seen. But I don't think it should be seen as controversial for the inspectorate to be able to say, this isn't safe, let's take some action. I would hope that some sensibilities would come out of that to say that it's a good idea. So I'll leave it there, Andrew, and allow time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. And I think you've queued up my first question there, because I think I should ask Martin to give any reaction to what you've just been saying, and if he feels able.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Tanya, for your comments, which were really helpful and really full, and I entirely understand where you are. I mean, given the pressure that the probation service is under and the reality that you see when you go out there on inspection and you just see the overwhelming caseloads that people are facing, it is a crisis. And to some extent, whether I agree with the amendments or not, what I can absolutely see the case for is that during the passage of the bill, people need to look at what powers the inspectorate has, and to ensure that we use them. And we shouldn't be afraid of giving some really difficult messages back to government in relation to, I want the probation service to succeed, but for it to succeed, it needs the resources. We need the right decisions to be made. And let's not confuse about the politics here. I mean, I think I was also quoted in The Guardian on my views on the unpaid work changes, because my view is very similar. The evidence doesn't support this sort of approach. We undertook an inspection into unpaid work earlier this year. We found that there was some really outstanding work taking place. Work that people that had perhaps been in long-term unemployment doing really valuable work for local communities, and more probably could be made of the value of that to local communities. But that wouldn't work if you were simply putting, pictures of those people, outside that particular work. And I was in Cardiff just last week, saw some really fantastic work taking place, very much embedded in a local community, and the garden that had been done in a local community in a really beautiful place that people could spend time. And they told stories about how some of the men that had obviously, fulfilled their order, took their children to the garden that they'd worked on. I don't think it would quite have the same thing if, there were pictures there named and shaded in relation to the work it is. I think it completely misunderstands the reasons why people offend and the reasons why they change. The reasons why people go back into communities, it's about relationships. It's about, feeling that, often many of the people that we see have been ostracized from their community. They're at the at the margins. We need to ensure that people are embraced in their communities and given second chances. And I don't see anything in naming and shaming that does that. But I'm certainly not afraid of taking on extra powers, depending on what Parliament thinks.
Thanks, Martin. I want to pick up on something else that Tanya mentioned to open the questions, and that is just reflecting on the history of restructuring in probation. Obviously, we saw a very controversial and unsuccessful part privatisation. We then saw probation brought back into the public sector, but it is still merged with the prison service. It's not the kind of local structure that Tanya mentioned, and that indeed your predecessor in his kind of final words in the role, Justin Russell, said needed to be effected if probation was really going to deliver what we want it to do. The government has ruled out that kind of restructuring, and I think there is a sense that that's partly because of fatigue from probation staff. But nonetheless, I am interested in the panelists' thoughts on whether ultimately we are never really going to have a properly effective probation service unless we do return it to independence and a more local structure. Who would like to kick off with thoughts? Well, I'll ask Tanya to go first, and then Martin. And then Helen.
Andrew, it's interesting that we've heard that argument for a while now about change fatigue. And I think there's a fundamental difference in getting probation out of the civil service as a change, because the staffing group and members, it's the policy they want to see happen. It's actually a change that will have the staff group on side, and therefore is going to be less of an arduous battle than the previous significant changes. But I think it's also important for context to recognise that the probation service is continually going through phases of change. So if change fatigue really was such an issue, we wouldn't have meeting after meeting about how we're going to restructure, how we're going to change the processes, how we're going to reduce workloads, how we're going to change job descriptions. I mean, it is endless. Every single week there is a meeting about change. So I find the change fatigue a very weak argument, but I also don't find it surprising that the senior leadership in HMPPS who are advising the ministers don't want to give up their own jobs. I mean, they would literally be putting themselves out of work. So it's not surprising that the message to ministers is opposed to this policy. But I genuinely do not think the probation service can survive in its current form. It is not fit for purpose to be in the civil service. It doesn't suit the service, and it won't succeed until it's out.
Thank you, Tanya. Martin.
Wow, what a great question. I mean, for me, when I was appointed into this post 18 months ago, I, at that point, was taking the view that there's been too much change. We need a period of stability. And my contrast actually is with youth justice services, where actually we do see much, much better performances. But that is local autonomy. That is a period of stability. For me, the jury is out in relation to the current structures. My very strong view from what I see on the front line is, generally speaking, local leaders that really seek to push at their local autonomy, but also have some distance away from that sort of what I describe as sort of the London Whitehall stuff, tend to be the better performing areas and regions, people that are really pushing at the boundaries. So if you were talking about in the lifetime of this Parliament, I think we need to be open-minded rather than saying that the changes that have been made, and let's be honest, I think when the decision was taken to sort of shut down the CRCs and move to a national structure, I think we all welcomed that at that point in time. But if you look at the inspection results, I see no sign of improvement in performance so far since the creation of the single unified agency. So I always think be driven by results, and ultimately any high performing organization that I've seen has local autonomy, local accountability.
Thank you. Helen. Sorry, you're mute. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I think there's another dimension to this which we haven't talked about yet, which is also was also coming through the sentencing review, and that is the contribution of the voluntary sector to probation, partly to reducing the pressures, but also to this question about kind of modelling and what does it look like if you change the structures. We know there is intended to be funding within the 700 million to help the voluntary sector to work more closely with probation. We don't know what that looks like yet, and we don't know what proportion of that will be. But we also know from HMI inspections of looking at the voluntary sector contribution that it isn't working well enough. The voluntary sector out there doesn't think it's working well enough. I don't know quite why it isn't easier for the probation service to bring the voluntary sector closer. I can see that for practitioners, it's incredibly difficult on a day-to-day basis to build relationships with small organisations in communities, but that actually is what needs to happen. And if we are to see a shift away from a centralised, over-controlling, civil service-driven probation service into communities, those organisations on the ground wanting and really, succeeding in small ways, working with individuals who've been in prison and in difficulties are the key to this. So we need to see some modelling. What does this look like when it works well? We need to see the modelling, and we need to see more energy in communities about engagement with communities. Now, that brings me also to this question about governance and the youth justice model, because of course, youth justice, although it's centrally funded, is governed locally by local authorities. Any of you in the audience who have anything very much to do with local government or anything to do with local politics, actually, will know that the whole issues around the probation service and the justice system and the prisons almost never come into the conversation with local government because it is not their job. It's not their responsibility. So here we are, communities in which are, offenders, if you like, are within our communities. There are children. There are children's children, and as communities and local authorities, we are not stepping up at all. And we should be. And you're not going to see the probation service moving successfully into communities unless the community is able to come close to the probation service. And the voluntary sector is one of the key bridges for that. It's not happening. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that some of this starts to shift if we're really talking about further change. And I certainly think, change fatigue is not a good argument at the moment for all sorts of reasons.
Thanks, Helen. I'm going to look at the questions now in the Q&A box, and the first couple of questions are both on recall. There's one, I think, referring to the new fixed term recall period of 28 days. And that question is asking how this is going to impact on the probation service. The other question is more generally about what can be done about recall and the extent, as Martin was referring to, how widely now it is used. Yes, our panelists, do you have any thoughts you'd like to volunteer on recall and the new fixed term recall? Martin and then Tanya.
I think I beat Tanya by a couple of seconds there, which was shooting for the sort of start line. So a few thoughts on this. I think we need a proper detailed look at what is happening on recall and what has happened over many decades that has led us to the position that we're now in. I think it still remains true that around about 75% of recalls that you see are for what I describe as non-compliance reasons, people breaching the terms of their license. And of course, there need to be consequences in relation to where people deliberately break the terms of their license. And I think Guy's example was really interesting in relation to the story that she tells. But the numbers, and again, when they introduced the early release scheme, and my concern was, okay, then I can understand that you're going to relieve some pressure on prisons, but inevitably a lot of those people will be back in within a reasonable period of time. That's exactly what you're seeing. And the reason for that is because what work is taking place in prisons is not tackling the underpinning reasons and the chaos in people's lives. So people are coming out of prison ill prepared. If they've got a drug addiction when they come into prison, they're still likely to have it when they come out. If they were homeless, when they went into prison, they're probably not going to get a home when they come out of prison. Probably actually we make it more difficult. There's lots of people that are probably building their drug addiction in prisons. And then I think the probation service is so badly overstretched that all of the support services that we need to be in place to deal with the pressures that they're under are not there. And therefore what you see, and what I would describe it as, is there is chaos that happens in people's lives, and that tends to precipitate the recall to custody. And I wouldn't for a moment blame the probation officer for making that decision. It's, you know, if you've got an unsustainable caseload, you haven't got enough hours in the day, you sometimes just can't see the wood for the trees, and you can't give Mr. Jones the assistance that he needs to ensure that he stays on the straight and narrow. So I think we need to take a step back and look at the recall system and bring it back to this question of what I describe as significant risk to the public. That's what really, I mean, and again, that's the lifeblood of the parole board is protection of the public. I think we need to bring it back to that and consider what are the other measures that we can do to ensure people comply with their license. And to some extent, my other observation would be, do people understand enough about what their license conditions entail? We know the level of literacy of people living in prison. We know that the length of license periods has got longer and longer and longer. And then finally, this point around serious further offences, which I mean, Gay's example is a really good one. What is the argument that in Gay's case, there's a risk to the public that she's going to cause harm from the fact that they've been unable to fit an electronic monitoring device of the right size? It's preposterous. And really what it's about is enforcement. And I think it loses respect for the system. And of course, there are a small number of cases where it is about risk, but almost it gets lost within the overall numbers. I think it needs to a really strong look at to ensure that if you had a more confident, better resourced probation service, I think the numbers of recall would come down because the probation service could hold that risk in the community. But I think it's going to have to come with a sort of cultural change looking at the attitudes to risk.
Thanks, Martin. Tanya.
So I can echo Martin's comments on that, so I won't speak for long. But I think also it's very symptomatic of a overworked probation service that they become very risk averse because you aren't prepared as a practitioner to give that person a second chance, or as soon as you start doubting, because you haven't got the time to put into that individual, you become risk averse, and so you go to recall. And I think that culture has also been magnified by some of the quite high profile serious further offences we've seen in recent years, which, although they are reviewing the process of serious further offences, I think the way that they are perceived and the way staff are treated who are investigated still has a considerable way to go, because it causes such high levels of anxiety amongst staff, and therefore you are more likely to use recall as your safe bet in order to not have that serious further offence happen. No one wants to be holding the case when the music stops. So I think there's a number of factors, but a lot of work has got to be done to really review, and I think Martin's idea of reviewing how recall is used would be really helpful.
Thanks, Tanya. Helen.
Thanks. I completely agree with both Tanya and Martin on this subject, but I just wanted to also add into the mix the importance of approved premises and hostels, if you like, against this lack of chronic and continuing lack of accommodation and housing. And we know that that's also creating massive pressures on communities, on local authorities, and not about to be solved quickly. But the potential increase in approved premises is more amenable. The research and the outcomes on use of approved premises is positive. It's good, whether they're in the independent or closer sector. So I would be wanting some of the 700 million to go on the expansion of approved premises as a hedge against recall, particularly.
Gay, I saw you furiously nodding points there, particularly when Martin was speaking. I don't know if you have any thoughts yourself you'd like to add as somebody who was recalled.
Well, I feel I'm not, I know I spent time in prison, but I don't call myself an expert. I mean, I'm just observing that people with mental health issues, addictions, all the things that you work with every day, went out into the community, and because there was nothing there for them, they're popping back. I mean, I don't have to tell you that, it's obvious. I mean, some women spent 2 nights sleeping in the bus stop outside the prison, and eventually somebody noticed that she was still there after 2 days. So she's coming back, but prison hasn't really addressed her issues, and I know that everybody's incredibly overworked, particularly probation service.
Yes, I think we hear a lot about prison overcrowding, but a lot less about probation overcrowding, and the fact that the probation service is also overcrowded, and that's before we even get to the ambitions that the sentencing bill has. I'm going to move to the next questions in the Q&A, and there are a couple on recruitment. One is saying that a lack of experience in the probation service was mentioned as a problem. If there's a big recruitment drive, how can we equip new recruits who may lack experience? And then also a question about allowing more staff with lived experience, I assume, of the criminal justice system into the probation service. What can be done to help people who have that experience work in probation? Any thoughts from our panelists on this recruitment point? Tanya, and then
Yeah,
Martin.
so it was a motion that was passed at AGM, our AGM, either last year or the year before, about the current training not being fit for purpose. So the process to qualify as a probation officer has been cut back so much. Certainly when I started, it was 2 years. You can now do it within 15 months. And so some of the really important parts of that training have been lost, and things like professional boundaries, which you can't just teach in an e-learning package. You have to actually have some experience of and almost be mentored in. But now a lot of the training is done online. And so when people qualify, they just don't feel confident to do the job they've just qualified in. And I think that's a big thing that we hear from newly qualified officers. That, along with the fact that they are witnessing their colleagues getting getting burnout and going off sick with mental health issues. We have P-Quips, the trainees, saying, as soon as I qualify, I'm going to go and get a job somewhere else because I've got the qualification, which means I can do something and not work in this place, which is horrendous. And also, I think because of pay, we don't retain people. We are not comparable to other professions in terms of our pay. So a lot has to be done to ensure that those new recruits are given the time to bed in and find their feet. But unfortunately, as soon as they qualify, they are given a massive caseload and left to pretty much get on with it. And I know numbers of offices where the most experienced member of staff qualified 3 years ago. We also know of senior probation officers getting their jobs after 6 months of being qualified, and how you can have oversight of a staff group and all of that professional responsibility when you've only been qualified for 6 months is lost on me, I'm afraid. So I think there has to be a real review of invest in the training instead of using it as a way of cutting back on money, but also a better mentoring relationship for people when they do qualify.
Thanks, Tanya. Martin.
There's a lot that Tanya's just said that I agree with, so I won't repeat that. But I mean, for me, the inspectorate did a report on recruitment, retention, and training at the back end of last year. It's well worth a read. There were some really important recommendations for HMPPS there, in particular around their training point. The most depressing thing, which I think goes right back to Tanya's remarks about how do we capture this new generation of probation officers? Because, of course, last summer when they introduced the early release scheme, what you'd ideally want to do is go to the job centre and say, we need another 2,000 probation officers immediately. And, if you're looking for accountants, you could do that. But with the loss of experience, the only way you can replace that is to rebuild that experience. So the people that you're recruiting and training now, you need to ensure they stay with the service. And my observation of the efforts that are being made to recruit more officers is that's very commendable. But if you're finding a not dissimilar number that are leaving every year, then it's like trying to fill up the bucket and you've got a hole in the bottom. You make no net difference. And a lot of that, I think, is about giving them a job that is achievable. That's part one for me, looking at the morale of the service. And some of that, and I guess my read across to the proposal on naming and shaming, if you did a survey of probation officers that have done that really difficult job at the front line, how many of them genuinely think that is an idea that is going to give them any kind of assistance in the job that they're, the very difficult job they're doing in terms of building a relationship with somebody? People need to think about that, not just simply say, is this a good headline, but actually what is it as a tool for probation officers to do their job better? And then pay, I think, is incredibly important as part of this package. And of course, as Chief Inspector, I need to be a little bit careful. It's not my responsibility. But what I would say is, surely there is a public interest to ensure that we have sufficient staff in the probation service to manage a really difficult, complex group of people, some of whom pose a risk to the public, but also most particularly, these are people for whom, if you resource the probation service to do the job we would want them to do, you have fewer victims, you have less crime, less reoffending, and a smaller prison population. What's not to like in that? I think that's absolutely the case that we need to make, is to ensure that we retain enough people and to ensure that the probation officers that we're recruiting today are still with the service in 10 to 20 years. I describe myself as a dinosaur. I've been around the world of the MOJ for more than 30 years. My question is, how many of those new probation officers are still going to be in the service 3 decades on?
Helen.
Thank you.
You're on mute again.
Again. So, yes, I agree. There needs to be a massive campaign on recruitment into the probation service, and there needs to be a strategy about praising the probation service. And if we can, hold in tension the concerns that the inspectorate has and that the service has, but at the same time be positive and praise the practitioners and somehow shift the mood, really. But I did want to mainly just come back to this question of people with lived experience, because it is possible now to become a probation officer, probation practitioner in different roles with lived experience, but it still isn't easy. We've been dealing with a case recently of somebody who, was accepted and then kind of not accepted, and it's just, these things drag on because the systems aren't aren't working in parallel. There's a very rich vein of recruitment potential in the community with lived experience, and many of them are very enthusiastic and positive to work with probation. So I think that we need to address that much more effectively.
Thank you, Helen. We have a lot of questions around electronic monitoring. I'm going to try and sum them up. So there's a question around how to address inequalities and discrimination in tagging and the stigmatization that can come from it. A question about how we ensure it is not just a tool of compliance, but can be something that genuinely helps to reduce reoffending. A question from an inspection perspective: what are the biggest weaknesses that EM exposes? And from a staffing perspective, what would make EM genuinely useful rather than just an additional layer of surveillance, and to what extent does EM affect frontline probation officers' ability to build relationships with the people they supervise? So lots of potential things. I'm not suggesting the panel have to address all of those thoughts, but have you any thoughts on some of those questions? So Martin, thank you, and then Helen.
Wow, it's really tricky when so many good questions to answer them and give to sort of full justice to them. I mean, my view on electronic monitoring, from what I've seen of the evidence, is that it can be a useful tool when used appropriately to the needs of the individual case. What concerns me is if it is used as a sort of a blanket rule to be imposed on all offenders, and there's no real imagination used in the way in which it's used. Now, I am, for example, a big fan of the electronic monitoring of alcohol consumption, but not on the basis of using it punitively, but using it as a basis that, we know that a number of the recalls, for example, that come immediately after people leave custody is because, as unfortunately, maybe the nature of our civilization. Lots of men come straight out of pub and they straight out of prison. They go straight to the pub and they get drunk and they don't even turn up at their approved premises. They miss their first probation appointment, and the recall is precipitated from that. If you just encourage some responsible drinking, that is helpful. It also may be an indicator of alcohol dependency in some cases as well. Now, in relation to the sort of the more generic tagging and it being used for all offenders, my question is what is the real purpose of doing that, and what is the value in individual circumstances? The reality is, I don't think the general public are very understanding. I think that I certainly remember reading stories of, if somebody sees a tag on somebody, that they assume that they're a sex offender. So is that really the sort of society we want to encourage, in which people get these warped assumptions about what is going on? The way it would be more useful, actually, I do think that we can perhaps use it more imaginatively in relation to the protecting of victims around domestic abuse, stalking, that sort of thing. I think that's something that needs to be looked at quite hard. Certainly at the parole board, we quite often imposed some quite extensive exclusion zones for people but quite often there was not a tagging restriction attached to that to ensure it's enforced. That is a sort of imaginative, proportionate, based on risk. But if it's just used on everybody, I worry that £700 million that the government has set aside to improve the work of probation can be spent very, very quickly on something which gives very, very little value for money for the public purse. If we had the choice, I would put the majority of the money into staffing, ensuring we've got the workforce that can do the job as well as possible, rather than putting a tag on everybody's ankle.
Yeah, absolutely. Helen.
Thank you. I guess the first thing I'd say about this is that if we're going to succeed in persuading a government to reduce the prison numbers, there's going to be a price. There always is. Labour governments are often more punitive than Conservative governments when it comes to trying to reduce the prison population. So I don't think this is going away, and I do think we need to engage and address it. I don't think the history of the private sector running electronic monitoring has been a happy or successful one. It's a really challenging question for probation to move closer and take greater control of electronic monitoring, but I think it does have to happen. But the question of equalities is a really important one. We don't have sufficient research. We don't have enough research about the impact on minority communities. We don't have sufficient research about the impact of electronic monitoring on women. And we don't have sufficient research about the impact of electronic monitoring where there are children involved. So there is a lot of work to do, and it's not being done in parallel with the increase that we're seeing at the moment. I think that it's interesting, actually. Andrew, you might remember this, but in a recent conversation at the House of Lords, there was a discussion with one of the members of the Select Committee who reminded us that Probation Service of yesterday was very reluctant to accept that it had a responsibility for control as well as care. You know, the advisor, assistant, the friend. I don't say we're in an exactly parallel situation, but it was a very interesting conversation. And I think, you know, the Probation Service probably has got to move into this space, which is a more controlling space than it wants to be in, if it is going to be able to minimize the damage of the potential of electronic monitoring in the future. So I think it's a very difficult tension, but then it always has been, I suppose. The Probation Service is all about managing tensions between control and care. There does seem to be a lot of evidence that the alcohol monitoring tags are quite successful. Some of the recipients and users of the tags are actually quite positive about it. There is evidence about changing people's behaviour, breaking patterns of behaviour. That may be more successful with young people than it is with older people. That's okay, let's do it. And we don't know enough about how long the benefits last for, the changes in behaviour can, you know, how long they can be sustained for. We need to know, but certainly there is benefit there. The purpose has got to be the rehabilitation of offenders, which is about reducing offending, isn't it? Rehabilitation, really. A rehabilitated offender is, we know, someone who doesn't reoffend. That has got to be the purpose. And we have to manage our way into this increased debate about control and rehabilitation.
Thank you, Helen. Now, we are unfortunately running out of time, and there are many questions that we haven't been able to cover. But I'm going to pick one last question for the panel, if anyone would like to give a response to it. And it's about the media. It's from Vicky Fobo, and she's asking whether the panelists have any thoughts about the importance of media attention about the probation crisis. How important is it to draw the media's attention to the problems that probation faces, and what benefits that can potentially bring? I think it's talking about tensions. I think there's probably a risk as well there, because obviously we want we don't want media coverage that might argue against reform. But yeah, what do people think? Martin?
Thanks, Andrew. I think it's really important that we engage with the media on this. Certainly at the Parole Board, I think the Parole Board did itself no favours by not being open and transparent about the decisions that we were taking, the reasons for those. We did the very successful BBC Two documentary on the work of parole, which I think, again, illustrated the fact you're doing a very difficult job, but actually, generally speaking, it improved public confidence in the system. So I think the more of that is great. The one caution that I would have, Andrew, and I think you absolutely shone a light on it yourself, is that it's not alarmist. One of the things that I always remind people of is, despite the challenges, the huge challenges facing the probation service, if you look at the number of serious further offences, it's still true to say that the probation service, as a rule, keeps communities safe. Serious further offending is thankfully very rare. And it's important to place that in context. People always want to jump to those very rare examples when things go seriously wrong, and that makes the headlines. Underneath it all, the bottom line job of the probation officer is to work with somebody on probation to ensure you understand their needs, understand the risk they pose, and to work with that offender and turn their lives around. And the numbers still show that actually, if you invest in the probation service and you give them the training that they need, it can make a significant difference. And let's not be afraid of showing those success stories that perhaps are not glamorous, but they are, the nature of the work. So I think we need to do more to promote what we're doing. What we do know is that certainly short custodial sentences are a complete waste of public money, given the results they come up with in terms of reoffending rates.
Helen, thanks, Martin.
Thank you. I would say, first of all, that the media needs to be much better informed about what public opinion actually is in the area of sentencing. There is a lot of evidence to indicate that public opinion is sensitive, thoughtful, concerned, interested, worried about offending, but is not necessarily, punitive and all of that. And that evidence exists, and the media systematically ignores that evidence and seeks to be populist. So I think that there is a real need to push the media with more information. Every now and then we suggest to various aspects of the media that it's time they made a television programme that took the probation service seriously, in a way that is a bit like the post office story. Wouldn't that be nice if we could pick up TR and turn it into a story like the post office? Not to just tell the story again, but to engage people's imagination with the probation service. So that's my final thought. If we're going to move this forward in terms of recruitment, perhaps the best TV dramas need to focus probation officers in very positive lights in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Helen. Tanya.
Thanks. As the press official, I feel like I should comment on this question. So I've dealt with probably the entire spectrum of the media when it comes to covering probation, and NAPO is quite effective at getting those stories out there and getting in the press. And that's not always about bashing the government of the time, but sometimes it's about the good news stuff as well. But I do find it very interesting, and I smiled when Helen said about lack of informed media, because I also think they have a very poor understanding of what the criminal justice system is, what a sentence is, what the processes are. I spend an inordinate amount of time explaining processes of recall or processes of parole to kind of mitigate against some of the sensationalism that I think happens a lot. And I turn down a lot of press stuff because it's very sensational, and they don't want to focus on the facts. They just want to make a massive story, and sort of feed into the serial killer true documentary stuff. So I think it's a very mixed bag, and I think once you've got a relationship with certain journalists who you've had that investment of time with, it's much easier to then be able to put forward the stories in a much more managed way, and that tension is reduced quite considerably. But that does take quite a long time. And if you look at something like the BBC, an awful lot of BBC staff are actually on temporary contracts. So you will have a different person ring you every 6 months, even though it's exactly the same area. So I think cultivating relationships with the press can be very difficult. And I think that sometimes the press don't want the measured response. They want that sensationalism, and therefore that's what they're going to go for. And I think also it's surprising of what they will see as the hook for a story. I remember during TR speaking to a journalist with one of my NAPO colleagues, and the NAPO colleague was explaining that the CRC in their office now has ownership of the water fountain because it's on the CRC side of the building as opposed to the MPS side of the building. And the journalist thought that was the best story ever. And it ran as quite a big story. And you sort of sit there going, actually, the privatisation and the risk to the public is a much bigger story, but for the journalist, this was classic example of how privatisation has gone mad because of the water fountain. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of cultivating those relationships, but I think the press also need to spend some time actually understanding the subject matter a little bit better.
Thank you, Tanya. Well, we are out of time. We've actually gone over, but I am very grateful to all our panelists and to our audience and the many questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get through all of them. I just want to close by reminding everyone that the Howard League is a membership organisation. We do these events and everything else that we do thanks to the support of our members, so please do consider joining if you're not a member. And if you visit our website, you can also sign up to receive our email updates, which will also tell you about events like this. This is a series, this is number 13. We were worried it might be unlucky, but I think it went well. We're very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.